The subject this morning is sensualities. This is a subject that I felt compelled to talk about this morning for a couple of reasons. One reason, because it's taught in the Bible. It should be taught here. Hopefully, many of these things are taught in the home between parents and their children, but oftentimes they're not. There's a second reason I was compelled to bring a lesson against sensualities, but in just a moment I'll further explain that. This is not a fun topic to talk about. It's probably not a fun topic to listen talked about either. It's very, very ugly, and it's very, very dangerous to the Christian. Sensualities are something that Satan has perfected in his chest of weapons and tools to cause us to stumble and fall. And we need to take it very, very seriously. Sensuality is defined as shameless conduct, a devotion to gratification of the body and fleshly appetites, free indulgence of carnal and sensual pleasures, lewdness. You know, I also found a sort of an extension to the meaning of sensuality that had to do with violence. I was a little bit surprised at that. But the context that we'll be thinking about sensuality this morning primarily has to do with what I just read, especially those free indulgences of carnal and sensual pleasures. In Romans chapter 13, Romans chapter 13, in verses 13 and 14, Paul wrote, "Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lust." Now, Jesus further added to that, or actually before Paul, but over in Mark chapter 7, Mark chapter 7, verses 20 through 23, Jesus was saying, "That which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of his heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, the fornications, the thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All of these evil things proceed from within and defile the man." Our behavior and our conduct is pretty well exhibited by what's in our hearts. What we take into our hearts, what we make the treasure of in our hearts. You can be turning over to Proverbs chapter 4 now. But from the heart is where probably 95% of our definition comes from. You know, we can fool each other for a while. We can fool others for a while. But sooner or later, Rob talked about truth a while ago. Sooner or later, the truth of what's in our hearts comes out. Sooner or later. It just works out that way. I can't explain why, but it just works out that way. We are defined by what we take in and put into that treasure chest of our hearts. I want to bring to mind three things this morning. In Proverbs chapter 4, picking up in verse 23 again, like Jeremy read a while ago, "Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life." Now, those springs of life, I take him to mean those characteristics that we demonstrate, that behavior, that conduct that we exhibit among ourselves and among others that we live around each day. Those are the springs that he's referring to here. Watch over your heart, because that's where you come from. That's where you come from. Either good or bad in your life comes from your heart. The first thing in verse 24, he went on to say, "Put away from you a deceitful mouth, and put devious lips far from you." Be turning over to Luke chapter 6, if you would. Let's see what Jesus says again here about this. Luke chapter 6. Now, even though he mentions lips specifically, I want to put in here what you converse about, what you talk to people about, your dialogue with people back and forth. And of course, that includes your ears, another sensual part of your body. What you listen to can be part of this as well. And in Luke chapter 6, Luke chapter 6, verses 43 through 45, Jesus had this to say, "For there is no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor, on the other hand, a bad tree that produces good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For your mouth speaks from that which fills your heart." Now, we will go over to Ephesians chapter 4 in just a moment. But I want you to consider, this is not just bad language. That's not what he's talking about here, not exclusively anyway. Now, in Ephesians chapter 4, we'll get this out of the way quickly, but then visit a little bit about another aspect of this. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, Paul wrote, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear." And then just across the page, if you would, in chapter 5, look at verses 3 and 4. "But do not let immorality or any impurity or greed even be named among you as is proper among saints. And there must be no filthiness or silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks." Now, I take that to mean today, crude jokes around the office or in your workplace. "Hey, I heard a new joke today. I got to tell it to you." And you know how it goes from there. That's some of what he's talking about here. Don't participate in those things. Don't participate in those things. Get away from that. That's what goes into your heart. You listen to that kind of stuff, and that's what goes into your heart. The same with movies or music or things that you read, those words that you see in a book that can arouse a sensual feeling in your body, in your flesh. Put yourself away from those things. Don't let yourself go there. Now, I mentioned the office place a while ago. I want to also caution all of us, and we'll talk about the environment and the atmosphere we put ourselves in just a moment. Now you're going to think this is odd. But I remember back when I was about, probably, I'm thinking in my early teens. Now that would have been the mid-1960s. And so most of you can't relate to that. I understand that. Some of you can. But back in that day, very few women worked outside the home. Some did, especially in occupations like teaching, some secretarial work, things like that. Very few women on the production floor or in the military. You'll be aware of that, I think. And I can remember my granny. Now, she must have been mid-70s at that time, late 70s. And I don't remember the setting. I don't know if she and my mom were discussing something or just sitting around visiting. I don't remember the setting, but I do remember a comment that she made. Now, this is not verbatim, but I'm paraphrasing. But she made the comment that you put men and women in the same office, you're going to start having problems. And you know, that's true. That's true. You put men and women in a confined space, if you will. That's a setup for some pretty dangerous things. The husband or wife that works in that office with you may not be getting the emotional and psychological support they feel like they need at home from their husband or wife. It's very easy for a fellow worker to take that place. And that's where things start. That conversation that you allow yourself to take part of. And intimate things can eventually become a part of that conversation. And before you know it, there's a slight bump. May have been accidental, may not have been. And before you know it, you feel something sensual going on. Well, that's where you better start exercising self-control as a Christian. That's where you better get a handle on it. Because I'm telling you, Christians fall just as hard and fast as anybody else. Under the right circumstances and in the right environment, be careful as you engage in conversation with others. Not just the opposite sex, but men to men, women to women. Don't participate in those conversations that go to areas that are going to fill your heart with bad things, with evil things. Put away from yourself devious lips. They can lead to destruction. In verse 25 of Proverbs chapter 4, he went on to say, verse 25, let your eyes look directly ahead and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. I want to look at what Jesus said early on in his Sermon on the Mount as he began his ministry. Over in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And this is a hard one. This visual enticements, that's a hard one. But look at what Jesus says in verse 27. In verse 27 and 28 of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman is to lust for her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, I'm not aware of anywhere in Bible times where that was actually done, but I think we can see the message, the lesson that Jesus is putting forth there. Shield your eyes from those things that lead to evil thoughts. Shield your eyes from those things. There's probably no better example of this than what David experienced. And if you would, turn over to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel, in chapter 11, 2 Samuel chapter 11, we're just going to read a couple of verses. I think you probably know the story, but to make my point, we can see it just in the first couple of verses. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, then it happened in the spring at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. Now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw, with his eyes he saw, a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. Now, we don't need to read any more of the story. We know the rest of the story. But David allowed his eyes to focus in on this young, beautiful woman that was naked, all that flesh. Sounds like she was very attractive, while she was innocently taking a bath on her own roof. Yet David let lust enter his heart. James chapter 1. That lust led to sin. He was enticed by all this flesh of this woman, and that led to the sin that he committed. What should David have done? He should have exercised self-control and turned away from that. Now, you know, it's easy for me to stand up here and say these things, but when it gets right down to it, it's more difficult than it sounds. But the point is, don't let yourself get into situations that you can't control. If you can't control your thoughts, what's going on in your mind, get away from it. Get away from it. It's just going to fill your heart with evil. So I think David is a perfect example of that. Something else that goes on today, though, that might be a little more practical in terms of us understanding. You know, we see all this flesh and immodesty and everything all over the TV and all over the movie screens, and I mean, you almost have to live a hermit lifestyle to not see these things. But you do have a button there where you can turn things off and such. But, you know, anymore, things have changed. It's so easy to get on the computer. It's so easy to get that computer out, open it up, and go to one of those sites that has all that bad stuff on it, all that evil stuff. And not only that, you can do it without anybody knowing about it. Boy, that's a pretty neat setup. And this brings to mind the second reason I wanted to speak on this. Several years ago, a young Christian man called me. He was married, and I think they had one child at the time. And he asked if we could meet, you know. And so, sure. Come to find out, he had, I don't know if addicted is the right word or if habitual is the right word, but he had gotten engrossed in pornography on the internet. This is several years ago. And his wife had, and this is one of those occasions, you can try all you want, but sooner or later, those things in your heart are going to come out. They just are. And his wife found out about that. And it broke her heart. It broke her heart. And he swore he'd get off it. He would not do it again. He wouldn't dare go to one of those sites ever again. Well, he did. He did. And this time his wife said, "You better get some help. You better get some help because your marriage is in danger." Now, see the kind of danger you're in when you allow yourself to take part in those sorts of things, those things that arouse the senses in your body. Don't take this for granted. It's real. It's real. Satan uses these things day in and day out to attack us. Take it seriously. Let's move on over to verse 26 now of Proverbs 4. He went on to say in verse 26, "Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right nor to the left. Turn your foot from evil." You know, I don't remember exactly when it was, but our annual theme was found in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. Now what Solomon's saying over there in Proverbs is be careful how you walk. Be careful where you walk. Be careful for the atmosphere and the environment that you allow yourself to go into. And in chapter 5 of Ephesians, picking up in verse 15, Paul wrote, "Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." You know, sometimes we don't have a lot of choice in what our environment might be from time to time. I mean, especially those of us who work for somebody else. You know, we're assigned an office and a cubicle and all that kind of stuff. And I especially think about those men that are in the military and the situations that they find themselves in from time to time. And some of those situations, there's no negotiating. You go where you're told to go, and you do what you're told to do. But I especially think of those that have to go on deployment from time to time. And I've visited with Dave a time or two about this. I know Dave went to Korea for a year, I believe, alone, by himself. And that's what I'm talking about here. When men and women are yanked out of their homes and taken away from their families for 6 months, 12 months, whatever the case may be. It's a tremendous sacrifice. And I appreciate that. My little brother, he sacrificed a lot. But my point is, those situations set up a ripe environment for you to be compromised, for your morals to be compromised. Away from your family, away from your husband or wife, working side by side, sometimes 12 hours a day with another man or another woman. It's real easy for compromises to take place on both parts. And maybe initially it's innocent, maybe innocent. But that's where you have to have your guard up. You have to constantly be alert and aware, like 1 Peter 5. Satan is a roaring lion that's looking for somebody to devour today. So you've constantly got to be aware of the environment that you put yourself in. You know, I think of, I'm not a big swimmer. I don't like big water. I don't like oceans. That's what I mean by big water. I like the beach. I enjoy going to the beach. I'm fascinated by the relentless movement of the waves and the water and all that sort of thing. And I enjoy seeing my kids have fun in the water, you know. I personally don't care for the water. And, you know, at the beach, or at swimming pools, whatever the case may be, there's usually a lot of skin showing. Well, you know, if you can't control your thoughts in that environment, you need to go across the street to the cafe or something and have some French fries and a Diet Coke. You need to change that environment. You need to get out of there. And that can be said of any number of things. I'm not talking about just skin here. You may be in a situation where there's an attractive man or an attractive woman that has dressed that particular day that is just off the charts. He or she is just gorgeous, and he smells good. That sort of thing. No skin. It's just that those senses can be aroused by various things. Get out of there. Get out of there. Don't let yourself go there. And like I say, I'm especially, I know in visiting with Dave before, like when he was away for a year in Korea, I think about the first thing he did, as I recall, was try to seek out other Christians. And in a foreign place like that, that's difficult to do. I'm not sure there's an established place and time that Christians can go to worship God together and to fellowship with one another. And so that's very, very important when you find yourself in an environment that can lead to a compromising of your morals, that you You seek out other Christians for the support and the strength that you can gain from them. And we're not just talking about physical places. I'm reminded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul wrote in verse 33, he says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." You better choose your companions wisely. Whether you like it or not, you're going to be influenced by them in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's verbally and engaging in bad conversation, or whether it's called into because of that companionship, called into a situation where your eyes are going to be exposed to something that is sensual, or because of that friendship, you're led to an environment that will create those sorts of things. Choose your companions wisely, especially you young people. Especially you young people. Choose your friends wisely, because bad company can corrupt good morals. And don't think you're not immune to it. We all are challenged by those things. Well, what can we do? Well, I've mentioned self-control. You know, self-control, in Galatians 5, self-control is mentioned as one of the fruits of the Spirit. And then in 2 Peter chapter 1, those things that Peter listed that many of us refer to as the Christian virtues or the Christian graces, self-control is listed there as well. And you know, we talk about all these bad things out there in the world. And it finally dawned on me some time ago, and I'll use myself as an example here. I was baptized when I was 15 years old. I reached that point where, and I had known for some time that I should obey the gospel. I need to become a Christian. I'd known that for some time. But that drive didn't overcome the fear of stepping out in that aisle, you know, until I'd already known that for some time. But the point is, it got strong enough, that urge, that need to do the right thing got strong enough to overcome that fear of walking down that aisle and expressing my desire to be baptized. And then all of us, coming up out of baptism, coming up out of the water, we have that zeal. We have that elevated excitement about becoming a Christian. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But frankly, me, after the dust had settled and after all the pats on the back, within a few weeks, I had just sort of drifted back into my old routines, my old self. And then it finally dawned on me, just, you know, some years later, we come up out of that water. The world is still the world. The world's not going to change for us. Spiritually, the world has always been dark. Spiritually, it is dark. And frankly, spiritually speaking, it's always going to be dark. The world's not going to change because we obeyed the gospel in baptism. What's going to change had better be us. It's incumbent on us to change. In Romans chapter 12, this is a familiar passage, I think. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, Paul wrote, "I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice." Not a body that's burdened and bogged down with evil sensualities because of the conversation you engage in, because of what you let your eyes take into your heart, or because of the environments that you put yourself in. Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. We change. The world's not going to change just because we were baptized. We change. We take on new personas. We take on Jesus Christ. We become like Christ. We turn our backs on this world and all of those evil things that can go into our heart that can cause us to live for the flesh, to react to those sensualities. One more thought. Well, actually two more, but over in Hebrews chapter 5, right at the end of the chapter. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food is for the mature, who, because of practice, have their senses trained to discern good and evil. I hope we all realize that we've got to hone our senses. We've got to be able to recognize if a situation or a picture or a conversation, we've got to be able to recognize whether or not that's evil or good. And that takes practice. Anything you're going to be good at takes practice. So I encourage all of us to do that. I encourage all of us to, and you know, there's another side to this. You're in your office, and your good friend down at the end there, hey, Paul, come here. I heard a great joke last night. I want to share it with you. This man, such and such, such and such, wait a minute. I'm not going to listen to this. I'm not going to listen to this. But you know that I'm a Christian. I try to do the right thing. I don't every time, but I try to. And you know not to come to me with those kinds of things. You'd be surprised at the respect that you will gain by doing that, shutting those things down. Don't take part in them. Yeah, you may hurt somebody's feelings. You may embarrass them a little bit. You don't want to do that intentionally, but it's a lot more important that you not take those things into your heart just because that's a good friend. It's a lot more important that you shut that down than you take it into your heart, something that's evil. And you know, it may even cost you your friendship. But it sounds like that fella may be part of that bad company that leads to bad morals. So don't be afraid to speak up. Don't be afraid to, hey, you guys can talk jokes all you want, but I've got better things to do. I'm not going to listen to these things. Now that's just an example off the cuff, so to speak. One more thought. You know, throughout these lessons, I not only my lessons, but Jeff and Rob's as well, I find myself thinking about Job. For some reason, there are so many practical life lessons that we can learn from Job's life and experience. And I just found the bitterness lesson that we had and the mediocrity rising above that, and Job did. Job was far, far above that. And the contentment, the peace he still had for God. He no matter what happened to him, he refused to curse or to blame God, even though he was encouraged to do that by his very wife. But with regard to this lesson, I have always remembered just one verse that he made in Job chapter 31. And I suggest that of us, of what we read here. In Job chapter 31, in verse 1, Job said, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? Why don't we make covenants with ourselves? Why don't we tell ourselves truthfully that I'm not going to go to that place. I'm not going to see that movie. I'm not going to listen to this. I'm not going to read this. Why don't we make a covenant with ourselves that will help us turn away from those situations that lead to sensualities? We're Christians. We're baptized. We change. We change. We transform. So I think I'm going to suggest that we consider that we have a meeting with ourselves and that we establish guidelines and covenants that we will not go beyond, just like Job did with his eyes. That's just something that's always kind of stuck with me. And you know, if David had that covenant with himself, we may be reading a very, very different David. And if you think it can't happen to you, keep in mind that David was described as a man after God's own heart. And it happened to him. And it can happen to us too. Let's don't let sensualities take us out of who we are. We're Christians. We're Christians. Let's put into the treasure chest of our hearts good things. Good things, not evil things. Now, we have to be in this world. And until our day is done, we have to be in this world. But the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, God will not put you in any situation that you cannot overcome. And not only that, he will provide for you an escape by which you can get away from it. And next time you're tempted by certain language or certain, reading of a book or certain environments, next time you're tempted with that, try to think of that passage. God will provide for you a way of escape. And being in this world, we're going to be tempted from time to time. We just are. That's the way of the world. It's just what the world is. But we're not going to be tempted beyond anything that any other man has been tempted. And God is going to provide a way of escape. If we can help anyone this morning get their life right with God, we want to do that. If anyone here is considering baptism, we stand ready to assist you in that. And if anyone here needs encouragement, needs the prayers of the brethren here, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing the song of invitation.